Okay, it's 2 p.m. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th year of the ICB Spring Webinar Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone's doing well and staying healthy. If you're here today, you're here to learn from our colleagues from the American Institute for Research about fulfilling the promise, student outcomes in post-secondary CBE programs, always an important topic. This is the second or third time we have the privilege to have both Jessica Mason and Kelle Parsons to be on the webinar and sharing their research findings. So thank you both for your willingness to be on this webinar and sharing with the field at large. Some housekeepings for everyone. If you have any questions along the way, do please enter them in the question box. Our presenters will be reviewing them along the way and should be able to discuss during and after the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will pass the ball to Jessica and Kelle, who are going to introduce themselves, and they're going to take it from here. Jessica, Kelle, welcome.
Thanks, Carlos. This is Jessica. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're excited to be here and share some of our work with you all. I'm Jessica Mason. I'm a researcher at the American Institutes for Research, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kelle. Would you like to say hi?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Kelle Parsons, also a senior researcher here at American Institutes for Research.
And Kelly's joining us from Massachusetts. I'm in Chicago. We also have up here on the screen a little bit more about our CBE research team, a few other colleagues. And so if you're interested in learning more about our team and about our work in general, you can visit us at cberesearch.org. So we wanted to share just a little bit about what we do. Our post-secondary CBE research team has been working on studying adoption of CBE programs at institutions since 2018, and more about those programs and what they can do for students, which will be our focus today. And since 2015, we've been engaged in research about CBE programs, about students' experiences, and we've learned a lot along the way. We are currently hosting a collaborative of research partners that's focused on CBE and CBL, along with administering the National Survey of Post-Secondary Competency-Based Education. And so we have a few different things that we focus on doing here. So collaboratively developing a research agenda for CBE and CBL to really kind of advance and direct the field in terms of identifying where we need more research. We try to engage researchers and practitioners in building more evidence about CBE so we can seed the field with more experts, more information, and really build capacity for more research. And then translating those findings and data for audiences whose actions may be able to affect the field of CBE. So just a little bit about our conversation today. So we've been working on a study studying student outcomes in CBE programs in comparison to students in traditional programs. And I won't share all of the details now because Kelle is going to get a lot more into that. But what we want to do is just share some overall takeaways from our study, and then really talk about the value of measuring outcomes and thinking about the importance of design choices for student outcomes. And then, of course, answering your questions, hearing your ideas and your feedback, and that's the most rewarding part for us on these conversations. So as Carlos mentioned, please feel free to drop any questions you have throughout. We'll either be answering them in the question box or pausing to discuss those. Feel free to use the chat to chat with each other or with us as well if you just have any thoughts. And we'll look forward to keeping this, light and conversational. So we just spent a long time introducing ourselves, so we were interested in just hearing a little more from you. If you could use the chat box and just tell us which best describes your interest in CBE. So no interest at your institution, or wherever you are interested but not started implementing, or maybe you're already adopting and that's in progress. You can put these in the questions or in the chat. Seeing some interest, some adoption in progress. Looks like kind of a mix so far. some with programs in place, also a combination. Maybe you have some programs already adopted and some implementing. So yeah, it looks like we have a good mix of experience and interest with CBE on the call so far. And we'd love for you, as we're going through, to just sort of keep in mind, based on your experience, how some of these findings track with the experience you've had, what questions those raise for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelle now to take us into the details of the study.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. And thanks everyone for inserting your current progress. This was a good reminder to me that I think we can use the chat to chat you, but I think you might only have the questions box to say something back to us. So please feel free to answer or to insert any questions that you have in that question box. We will try throughout to keep in mind the sort of mix that we see coming through of folks who are interested versus adopting or maybe have piloted, and we'll try to be responsive to that as we go through, but by all means, please do not hesitate to answer your questions. I consider that the value of attending live rather than watching the recording, right, is that we might get into a good discussion if you have questions, so please don't hesitate. Okay, hopefully I made the case strongly enough there. Here's, just to kick us off, a little bit of background about this study. So the motivation for this study, we have kind of a primary research question and then a secondary question that we hope to get to, and we'll talk a little bit about the success of that. So our primary question here is, how do student outcomes in CBE compare with those of traditional programs? My guess is that many of you have received questions like that, especially if you were making the case internally at your institution about starting a CBE program or even exploring it. We hear it a lot from policymakers who are thinking about whether or not to make resources available to CBE programs, for instance. So there's a lot of interest in student outcomes, and of course, because we care how students do in our programs and we want them to be successful. The secondary question that we hoped to explore was about how those outcomes vary by either program design or program components or student characteristics, right? So do certain types of CBE programs work better than others? Do certain models or approaches to flexibility or subscription pricing versus per unit pricing, those kinds of questions, as well as, does this work better for instance, adult learners? Those are the kinds of things we hoped to dig into a little bit more as a group. And just to kind of go one level deeper there, we often hear kind of this triangle or Venn diagram set of motivations or arguments for CBE, right? When people talk about, here's why we would consider CBE, the rationale generally is related to one of these topics. So first, improving access and success. So perhaps it's CBE is a pathway, for instance, for folks who can't make a traditional program work, perhaps for scheduling reasons is a common example. So this both expands access and their ability to enroll, or just makes it possible for them to continue and make it all the way to the end of their degree. Another is the price or cost to students. So perhaps CBE can save money. And then quality, right? So there's lots, these are kind of a combination of things people will say. One, that making it transparent to students, here are the competencies you are going to achieve, helps to improve quality. It can also articulate to employers, and the employers participating in the articulation of competencies can be sort of a pro on quality. And there are a few others we often hear about. So when we thought about studying CBE programs, we tried to sort of lay out the logic here. So if and then aligns to each of these. So if CBE programs allow flexibility in terms of timing and pacing, then that's where potentially we could be expanding access, improving completion rates for folks whose lives require flexibility out of their education. For price and cost to students, this is particularly true for if you allow for flexibility and in particular acceleration, and you use the subscription pricing model, which then would allow folks to, I don't like this term so much, but the sort of all you can eat, right? All you can learn model, so to speak. You can pay for a set amount of time and accelerate and therefore save money. And then third, when CBE programs identify the competencies and require mastery of each competency, right, rather than grading and providing sort of average performance as we do in traditional programs, students will better understand what they learn, why those competencies are relevant, and be prepared to demonstrate those to employers. So this is just a little bit of some of the kind of conceptual work we did to start off in this study. And I want to make sure that we don't act like this is the only study that's ever happened, or that we know absolutely nothing about CBE programs, because of course that's not true. There's been previous work on outcomes in CBE programs, and that's especially true studies for CBE programs that launched under TACT grants. So in community colleges, after the TACT grants of the early 2010s, a lot of those had independent evaluations, and so there's papers out there that share a bit about TACT grant CBE program outcomes. And then that first one with the photo on it is previous work we did. Carlos was a longtime partner of AIR and our studies. There's also examples of single institution case studies, right? So some leading CBE or institutions with CBE programs have started to share what they're seeing in their for student outcomes. For instance, Kelle has shared their data and put out a paper that can be really helpful. Those often have the benefit of diving deep on what their model is too, so you can learn a lot about design and things like that from that previous work. Okay, so about this particular study. So in an attempt to get beyond, just kind of profiling one single institution, we wanted to think about outcomes across, do we see patterns across several institutions? So we worked with 7 institution partners, and each of their programs took different approaches. So they had a variety of pricing models, or about half had a subscription pricing and about half had sort of per credit pricing. Assessment methods varied on a pretty broad spectrum, as all of them had pretty distinct faculty and staff roles, or disaggregated roles versus sort of reaggregated roles. And of course, the level and type of flexibility for students. I could probably talk about this for Carlos, but you would have to schedule me for maybe a 3-hour webinar to talk about the different types of flexibility for students and what that means for their retention or acceleration. But even little tiny policies, right, about even how quickly you can start the next competency after you finish one, are really potentially consequential when we look at this sort of data. So lots of variety. So we realized that meant we were likely to get a lot of variety in outcomes, but it also could mean that if we see a clear pattern, that's really promising, perhaps. So a bit more about these programs. So just to compare to kind of the national set, we worked with a mix of 2-year and 4-year institutions. So of the 7, 3 were 2 years, 4 of them were 4 years. In this column, we have the institutions with CBE nationally, just so you can see how representative or not that is of the national estimates. And in terms of control, 4 were public, 2 private, and 1 was for-profit, which generally, not exactly, but sort of directionally in line with what we see nationally. And just a bit over here about bachelor's versus the associate and certificate program, which, keep in mind when you see the data, you'll see different time to degree, right, for bachelor's degrees versus associate's degrees. So this has the credential type for each of the institutions. We anonymize them here, so you can I guess I didn't put the list of institution partners in this slide deck, but it's on our website. But we don't associate which institution has had which data, so you'll see A, B, C, D, E, F, G throughout. CBE sample size versus the comparison group sample size is here, so you can also keep that in mind. Not a common thing, right, especially early on, is that programs can be relatively small as they're sort of piloting and growing. So we needed to work with folks that had enough of a sample size, but just as, I think this might be a good reminder that these programs aren't tens of thousands of students, right? We're still working with a, medium-sized program. I see a question in here, were any of these direct assessment? Yes, one or two of them were direct assessment programs. I would have to double check that they maintained direct assessment. One of them maintained direct assessment during this time. I hope that helps. Okay, so before we get into the outcomes, I wanted to just give a quick tour of student characteristics, who we saw enrolling in programs, and how did those compare to the who we saw enrolling in their traditional programs. In general, I'm going to try to stay out of the deep details on methods, but just as a quick note, we worked with each individual institution to identify a comparison group that made sense for their institution. So either one other program or a set of programs to which we could compare the outcomes for those groups. So that's who you'll see in the comparison group. Okay, so student characteristics. Obviously, age is one of the main things we talk about when we are referring to non-traditional or new traditional students, right? So we get a lot of CBE might be good for non-traditional or new traditional students or working adults, right? We usually or at least in most of these cases, administrative systems didn't capture whether people were employed, but we did get, we do of course have their age when they started. So this is a chart, and just let me take another quick moment to just describe how to read these charts. So along the bottom here, you have each institution sort of with their CBE group and then their comparison group side by side. So when you're looking at this chart, don't compare the whole thing per se, but compare the two side by side for each set of columns, maybe set of bars. So in general, there's a lot of colors going on here, but in general, CBE students tended to be older when they started the program. You can also see this down here. This has the distribution in the chart, but down here is the median age at entry. So you can generally see some of the differences aren't huge, but some of them are larger, right? Almost 10 years different, only 1 year here. So that might give you a sense of, are you seeing folks that are older, like different profiles of students enrolling in these CBE programs? And in general, to some degree, yes here. Prior post-secondary experience is also kind of a common thing people say, right? Maybe CBE works particularly well for folks with some college, no degree, or for whom a traditional program didn't work, and so they maybe need something else. So we commonly hear that about CBE. So here we compare, and again, do the side-by-side, the students in CBE and comparison group, and this is the share that had any post-secondary credit. A quick note is that we did not compare here the number of credits that they had, right? So there might be differences in terms of number of credits, right? Maybe CBE students had 60 and comparison groups only had 12, right? Here, that both shows up as they had prior credits, in part because we couldn't quite really tell what credits might count, so it was harder to make sense of that. But generally, in most cases, the share of previous post-secondary credits were relatively consistent. Not in every case, but relatively consistent, right? There's some small gaps across some of these, some slightly larger gaps, one much larger gap, or difference, I should say. But in general, somewhat consistent. Okay. hopefully a picture, some ideas about who the students are forming in your mind. I'd be fascinated, for any of you who said you have programs up and running, I'd be really interested to hear whether you would say this squares with what you see in your own program. So race and ethnicity. We also commonly hear about CBE programs, and there's a paper out on this topic. Can CBE programs contribute to racial equity? I think it definitely remains an open question. So we wanted to look into that here. I wouldn't say this is the final word on that topic for sure. We generally did not see a consistent cross-institution trend, but in almost every case, white students were the majority in nearly all programs of both CBE and comparison. There are a couple exceptions, but very few. Two institutions had pretty similar populations in general, their distribution. One had a smaller Black population in CBE versus their comparison group. Two had the opposite. They had a larger Black population in CBE. And one institution fell on either side of a larger Hispanic population in CBE versus their comparison group. So kind of a mix when you back up and look across all of these programs. Ultimately, we think, and in some conversations with the partner institutions, some of this may be driven just as much by geography, especially, and perhaps recruiting practices are sort of who the pool is, but especially geography. Okay, Pell eligibility. So we know this is an imperfect proxy for socioeconomic status or income, especially for adult learners, but it's what we have to serve as a proxy in administrative data. So in general, most institutions have a lower share of Pell eligible students in their CBE programs than in their comparison group. This is actually, it might take you a second to read this graph, in part because it's probably flipped from how you might think of it. So the green here actually is yes, they have Pell. So a larger green bar means yes, Pell in, for instance, the comparison group. But as a reminder,
can I mention something here? This Pell is interesting because a lot of our students, that $750 flat rate tuition, a lot of them were actually out of pocket because many of them they've accumulated so much credit they didn't qualify for Pell, right? Another thing we saw was a lot of tuition reimbursement from their employers, giving the subscription model and less than $5,000 per year total, right? So I think these students are finding these programs attractive because they can either be self-pay or get funded through their employer. So just wanted to point that out there.
Yes, excellent point. Yep, that's we even wrote about employer benefits here, right? Paying for the program. So it might be that they're not even applying for financial aid, or it might be that they've exhausted financial aid. So yes, there could be a lot of explanations for this. I would never say, oh, we have evidence that CBE programs serve fewer low-income students. I don't think that's what we see here or what we could claim here. And that's, I would love, in the future, it would be fantastic to do a better, to look more deeply at income, or for those who at least apply for financial aid, expected family contributions, and things like that. Thank you, Carlos. That's a good reminder. Okay, so to the outcomes. Well, first, let me pause since we're at sort of a section break here. Carlos, are there any questions in the chat box or questions or points you want to raise here?
I don't see anything coming in yet. Guys, remember to jot down your questions in the question box.
Okay, excellent. All right, so to our sort of primary research question. Oh, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Is there a question in there now?
Yeah, yes. We did have a question. So what was the average tuition cost difference between the CBE program versus comparison programs?
Excellent. So we will get to that in just a second. We'll get to the difference in the total price that students paid during the course of earning their degree. If this question is more about like price point, that's a complicated question because sometimes they had different pricing models. This is, for a CBE program that had a subscription price, comparing that to a per credit price in the traditional program can get a little complicated. But we'll talk about that as an outcome here in just a second. So I'll revisit that question in just a couple slides. Okay, so student outcomes. So before we get too deep, I said that I wouldn't get too deep into methods or technical details. Of course, I would be delighted and have to talk to anybody who wants to dive a bit more deeply into the methods or technical details. So do not hesitate to email me if you want to get deeper on that, but I wanted to keep it light and exciting for today, or keep it at maybe the findings level for today. But one thing really resonated in some of the conversations we had as a partner group that I think it would be important to share, and it's at least a little minor introduction to our methods. So in general here, a descriptive comparison is useful, just generally comparing, an average to an average for the CBE program and the comparison group. That's a good starting point, and farther than we do in all sorts of different things that we measure in higher education. But that, of course, leads to questions like, but are the types of students enrolling in CBE programs fundamentally different than those in traditional programs? And is that actually the reason we're seeing these different outcomes? So please bear with me here. I had a little too much fun with this slide. There's sort of two situations, right? If no and if yes. So if not, if the CBE programs are not fundamentally, or if the students, are not fundamentally different between the two programs, the researcher is happy because we can compare those two groups with some amount of confidence that the differences in outcomes are because of the program model. That the CBE is the difference, right? That either improves or causes the improvement or the non-improvement of outcomes. But if no, the program leader might not be happy, right? So a program leader, if the students are very similar, the program leader might say, wait, the whole point of me starting this program was trying to expand access and support new types of students, new types of learners, adult learners in particular, for instance. So if the groups look the same, what happened here? Again, I'm simplifying, of course, to make this kind of broader point, but this is could be a rich discussion. If yes, however, if the two groups are fundamentally different on basic student characteristics, if yes, the researcher might say, uh-oh, but okay, that's fun for a researcher, right? Because that means we can try to do things statistically, or methodologically, I should say, to address that problem. So in this case, we modeled a student's propensity to enroll in CBE based on those characteristics, and then weighted the outcomes to create similar quote-unquote groups. Yes, this absolutely does leave out things like motivation or motivation or even other factors that we sort of loaded onto age, right? Like they might also be working, they might have children, and we don't see that, but we at least give it a try. But so the researcher might say yikes, but the program leader might be quite happy and delighted because that says, hey, we are indeed serving a new or different set of students. Or perhaps, maybe it's new. Maybe the alternative was they were never enrolled. They would never have come back to post-secondary education, for instance. Or maybe it's a better fit, right, for some of our students we would have otherwise enrolled. So, for instance, maybe older working adults have been trying to make our regular program work, but now this is providing a better fit. So we see them moving over to our CBE option. So again, this is just sort of a somewhat fun description of what we sort of wrestled with as a group. The other thing we should say, I talked a little bit about how we identified a comparison group. We had some good and long discussions about whether it's accurate to assume that the reasonable comparison is a student enrolled in the traditional program or whether this situation of their alternative was probably not to enroll in a program at all, right? Maybe they would not have been able to come back to post-secondary education without a CBE option. That sort of quote unquote non-consumer of higher education. So those are just, those can get you into some really interesting conversations, both about what we're trying to do, in CBE and how do you handle that from a research perspective. So I want to share those tidbits with you, but I'll stop there Carlos, unless if you see a bunch of questions, I can pause on this topic more, but otherwise I'll keep going. Okay, I'll keep going. I think that's the first time I've ever described a method, or even the beginning of a method, with emojis. I hope that does not get screenshot and put up on Twitter. Okay, so what did we actually find? So we're going to go kind of by metric here. So retention, we'll look first at retention and completion and other topics. So first, retention. We did not see a clear, strong trend across institutions. It very much varied what we saw. Sometimes they were comparable or similar. Sometimes they were substantially different, but it wasn't that they were all substantially different or all the same. It was really a mix. And so I mentioned earlier that we weighted the CBE and comparison group, to compare them a little bit more rigorously, right, to see if we could account for their income and characteristics. That was possible only for institution A, institution B, and institution C. So among those where that was possible, none of these, once we did that, turned into statistically significant differences. So statistically, we couldn't distinguish the retention rate from CBE and comparison groups. It was similar. There might be a lot of reasons for that. And just as a note for the figure, retention is a little bit tricky for CBE and comparison groups. We measured periods. So did you come back in the second whole period after you first enrolled, or a third whole period after you first enrolled? This is a little bit different than like a true fall to fall. We tried to do kind of a similar concept, right? But it wasn't truly like a September 18th census day to a September 18th census day or anything, in part because these programs are much more flexible and they might not be following exactly the same schedule. Okay, so I'd be interested. I wish we had all the reactions you have in Zoom so we could say, quick surprised face if you're surprised by this. I'll be interested in a few minutes to check on what's surprising or not surprising here. So basically, students are sticking around in both at about the same level. Completion is a next level of the question. So who actually gets to the finish line and completes their degree, and how does that compare between CBE and comparison programs? So again, in general, no clear strong trend across institutions. If you're a savvy chart watcher, you notice we dropped one institution. That was in part because of how much they didn't quite have enough time in the measurement window for us to measure completion. But among the three institutions for which we could do that weighting that I talked about, the institution A had a statistically significant difference between their CBE and comparison groups. So even though this difference looked large, once we weighted for student characteristics, it didn't hold up, which is, again, somewhat interesting. There's some really similar rates, generally, descriptively, but there's some indication that at least some programs have a slightly better completion rate overall. Okay, time to credential. This is an interesting one. So keep in mind here that this is only of people who finished their degrees, right? It's much like a time to degree measure that you might see in plenty of other places. So again, no clear, strong trend, which is becoming a theme, right, in part because we had such different types of models here. But of the 3 institutions for which that propensity score analysis was possible, at 2 of them, CBE students took statistically significantly less time to complete. And when this is measured in days over here, in part because not everyone had the same term length, so we did it by days. And our estimate is that they were essentially saving between 6 months, or one of them was a 6-month difference in the average, and the other was an 8-month difference in the average, which is, a non-trivial amount of time. That's some time that you can, either get back in the workforce or potentially get a promotion, or just not have another thing on your to-do list. Oh, I can hear someone.
We have an interesting comment question here from Mara. She says, I hope we're getting to this later, but she's really interested in what were the models that facilitated the statistics. So what specific, is it a subscription type model, or I don't know if you're going to hit this on this presentation, but I think there is interest to knowing what type of CBE model these programs were using. Mara, hopefully I got that right.
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. We can provide, we don't have it in this slide deck, but we can provide sort of a general look at some of the main features of their models. I think the one key thing is that, there are so many design choices embedded in a CBE program, right, between how you price it, to your faculty model, to your success coach model, that I'm assuming that question was about the completion, or first came up about the completion point. This institution can't, they can't identify necessarily what it is about their model that led to a higher completion rate, right? There's a lot of, CBE is almost like a bundled intervention, right? There's a lot of different things. So we can share what their whole model is, but it's possible that there's, one feature that makes a difference, right, that we can't unpack. We'll talk about the one time we could unpack it a little bit is with cost in a second, so I'll turn to that one next, since that's such an exciting topic. Okay. The other thing that I forgot to say earlier was about flexibility. So here's one thing about the model. We don't know that this entirely made it possible. There's a couple of different things that could lead to this difference in time to credential. So one, of course, is acceleration. And both the programs at institutions A and C did allow for some amount of acceleration. Not all CBE programs allow for substantial acceleration, but A and C did allow for that, which you can to some degree see here. However, there's another alternative, which is that maybe some institutions just do more to sort of recognize incoming credit or competencies, or that they're, that sort of front end part of it might actually help improve the time to credential. There's a couple different potential things. So I'm glad we're getting to the design question because it's the meatiest and most interesting, but it's also the hardest to answer. Oh, I see a question. Does acceleration in this context mean credit for prior learning or something else? Great question. So I was using acceleration to mean that someone can speed up through the program. So it can be credit for prior learning so that you just start sort of farther along in the program at the front end, but it can also be just moving through the material more quickly. So you're spending, in the course of a month, you're completing a course, taking the final assessment and moving on to the next competency or sort of competency bundle. So it's also just moving more quickly than, for instance, a traditional 15-week term, right? You're spending more time in the course of a week or a month, any unit of time, moving through the program. Carlos, let me pause because I think you all have a particularly interesting model that might be helpful to highlight.
Sure. So our model has a $750 subscription, right? So a student signs up for that 7-week term. They can take as few or as many courses for the same flat rate. So in terms of acceleration, for us, it's progress throughout the course and the term, right? So we're not measuring that acceleration from prior learning, if you will. So we'll take as much credits as we can. We'll try to get the military credits, work credit, and all that. But acceleration for us is if they're completing at a faster rate and adding more courses in the same time period. Now, having said that, in the course, we have a pre-test and a post-test. So the student does have competencies on a given subject, that they have a lot of work experience, and they're taking our data-driven decision-making course, and they're a data analyst. Well, given their level of competencies, they'll be able to quickly move in that course and move fast in that course to sign up for the next one. So for us, acceleration is during the learning, right? During the course and during the term. Hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. I see another question about the competency and skills framework, trying to design one and would like to see how others have done it. Oh, okay. That's a great question, but not what we have here today. I think Cbe might be a good reference for you. They might be able to point you into the direction of all the competency frameworks, or at least starting points that programs then adapt and riff on. Carlos, is there anything you want to add about competency frameworks?
What we can do, I think, is send a link in the chat box so everyone can have access to that. So you're exactly right. We would point to the Cbe network and their Cbe framework for that.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, I see another question. Any data and research about Cbe programs that do not offer a human advisor or program mentor coach? Oh, interesting. So not from us. All of these programs had human advisors or success coaches to some degree, all slightly different models, but all humans. I don't know of any programs that do not have that. Carlos, I'm just going to keep punting questions to you, though, to see if you happen to know of any programs that do that.
I do not. For the most part, and just speaking with different institutions and Cbe programs and our program in general, that human component, I guess, that success coach is critical for success in the program. I think unlike your traditional advisor, that success coach is very embedded, intrusive in our model. They work directly with faculty members. They work directly with students, even at odd hours of the day. So for us, the success coach model is very important for high retention and graduation rates. So I know that doesn't answer the question. We can follow up and see if there are models out there. But for the most part, the programs I have had interaction with, the success coach is a critical component.
Yep, great point, Carlos. I think almost every program we've worked with have said, something along the lines of like, all these other program design choices are important, but it's the success coach that actually we think makes a big difference, helping people set deadlines and work toward them and all sorts of things like that. So much so that some traditional programs are starting to pick up that concept. Okay, so just one more chart to share here. So total net price of the credential. So this is not a price per term or something like that, right? It's not a price point per se. This is the total net price that students paid over the course of their credential. So the big high-level takeaway, this is the one place we had a really common trend. At Cbe completers, quote unquote, saved money in almost every case. They paid a total net price lower than or equal to, once we weighted, the comparison group. You can barely see F over here. It was a shorter credential, so it wasn't as expensive, especially when you compare it to some of the bachelor's degrees. But that was a general kind of pretty common takeaway. There might be a few different reasons for this, right? This could be a situation where the price point was lower for their CBE programs. And one thing I will note is we tested whether this was, so we calculated this by the total amount charged to the student and then subtracted the amount they received in federal, state, or institutional grants. So this becomes their net price because that's what the student, or as Carlos pointed out before, sometimes their employers actually kind of experience. So it might be, they might take this out of loans, they might pay this out of pocket, the employers might pay it. There's a variety of options here, but that's what we're comparing here. And again, it's important to look, I pointed it out, especially on this graph, because the difference between C and S are so big here, but you can hardly see S. But I think it's important to sort of see these differences, and A and C, these differences were statistically significant after weighting.
Yeah, and I can mention, just to Mara's point about models, right, Kelle? We do, so our comparison group is a traditional completer program. So we are trying to serve the same student population in both programs. But the key difference here for us on net pricing is that one is a traditional paper credit hour model. So they're paying as they take on more courses in a traditional 16-week term in summer. Unlike our CBE program, 7-week terms at $750 subscription pricing. So as a student takes more courses, basically they're reducing their cost and time to degree. So in our, here as you see the net pricing, our students are saving roughly half the cost of degree, and that has a lot to do with a subscription versus a paper credit hour model.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm so glad you said that. I was distracted by talking about the chart and failed to mention the importance of the model here. So here, A and C both have a subscription model. So you have that effect that, or potentially have that effect that Carlos was just talking about. If people accelerate, they pay less overall. B did not have a subscription model, so they had per credit pricing for both. So that might be part of the difference that you see. So the key thing to consider, I think one thing I wished we could have gotten to, and maybe a key point here is that we couldn't get to this point, is does that play out for different types of people differently, right? So this is an average, but obviously every, if we showed you a distribution of each student and the total price they experience, it would be a bunch of dots, right, at different total amounts. And there's reason to at least consider whether different types of students sort of benefit differently from that subscription model. So our only, younger students, just as an example, actually able to accelerate, and so we're charging, older adults or something more for that degree? Or do we worry about in terms of race, ethnicity, like what types of students are able to accelerate and benefit from the cheaper, the way that acceleration lowers your total price? Those, we don't have an answer from that. We couldn't get there in this data with these data sets, but I would say that if you're looking at this in your own program, that would be a key thing to look for, is whether this is happening, whether this is playing out relatively equitably for your students. Okay, so with that, I'm done showing you charts, thank goodness, probably, right? But it's sort of a quick takeaway, and then we'll open it up for more questions, although thank you so far for all your good questions. So in general, there are signs that CBE programs are beginning to fulfill their promise, right? The shortening time to degree and reducing costs to some extent. And when they're, even when we don't see those statistically significantly, better outcomes, they're generally comparable, right? We did not find that CBE programs were way less likely to complete or way less likely to retain their students. That's not what we saw here. So under some conditions, better, but plenty of times comparable. But as I was just talking about, we can't really say much yet about how that varies by program design, with maybe the slight exception of pricing models, just because there's two pretty distinct options, subscription versus per credit. On all sorts of other ones, there's really a spectrum, and so it's really hard. We didn't have time to kind of create a nice typology and really try to measure that somewhat rigorously. Nor can we say much about student characteristics yet, due to, in part, smaller sample sizes among subgroups. So we just wanted to circle back again to kind of the big why even bother, right? So we evaluate programs to understand whether they're fulfilling their goals or their promise. And then hopefully, if they are, right, that means ideally that institutional leaders or state policymakers or even federal policymakers are dedicating resources to support them, or at least make it possible for these programs to operate. It appears, of course, that some programs are meeting that bar and others might be on the path to that. And a lot of the common conversation we have is about continuous improvement, right? So a lot of people are trying a particular model in their pilot year or years and sort of refining their model over time. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit, and in these last 10 minutes, I want to make sure we take the time to hear any questions or reactions, questions, what's most interesting, or what would you want to dig deeper on? Really, any of these questions, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Kelly, while people get their questions in, I just did want to touch, we are trying to delve into, performance, I guess, by variable, that makes sense. So by age group or by ethnicity, right? And so just in our early version of what we're looking at, what we're seeing is younger adult learners moving faster to completion, older adult learners taking more time but still retaining and completing. But again, maybe what they were looking for was the flexibility, not necessarily the acceleration piece, right? And then in terms of ethnicity, we are seeing that our minority students are performing at comparable rates as our white students, and having better time to degree rates and completion rates than our more traditional completer programs for minority students. So we're still early in the process. However, we do have 5 years worth of data, so hopefully we'll dig into that and try to put some research out for the field in terms of completion by specific demographic categories.
Yes, awesome, Carlos. Yes, and in some ways, research in this area is so exciting because programs get bigger and new programs start all the time. So I think that this will, hopefully there will be more and more data and research available in just, a relatively short time. That's a great point.
I love that. Yes, well,
go ahead.
Listen to this, Kelly, okay? So from there, I appreciate how hard isolating the impact of specific design features are, but curious as a researcher, what are your thoughts on how we can better understand that? It is tremendous potential for those looking to launch and scale programs.
That is an excellent question, and it sounds like we should have a follow-up conversation. So there are ways to do that. What we struggled with is we didn't have a great typology. So we started this work, 2017 maybe, Carlos? It was a while ago, and we didn't have a great typology at that point. Nor did we didn't have a single national survey complete at that point. So we didn't have a great sense of, can we really create categories and really map out kind of a theory of change, right, about why this feature or component of a program matters. I think that also the other thing that I would want, if I were doing that very carefully, is getting really deep in any institution's data. So what we had for this study was data from like student information systems, right? We had enrollment data, but we didn't have, for instance, any notes about or indicators or anything else about like time spent logged in or frequency and total number of outreach from your student success coach to that learner. So I think there are lots of ways that you could kind of get closer to understanding, if someone's getting a lot of support from a student success coach, right? It might appear, and they succeed, right? You can start to compare folks kind of actually experiencing some of the specific interventions. It's a little bit harder when you just have enrollment data and you have to kind of make assumptions about what they've experienced along the way. That was sort of an immediate brainstorm, but I think there are options to do that going forward. We just didn't sort of have the tools at the start of this project.
So Kelle, on that, right, on that point, how can institutions join this work? How can they participate? Is there funding available? Are there resources? I agree with you. It's still early. Only a couple of us are doing this type of work. So how can institutions join this work?
Oh, well, Carlos, I am glad you asked. Okay, so first, if you're interested in digging in a bit more, please reach out to us. So this is our website. Here, or the link is here. You can reach out to us at this general email address, or our email addresses are also on the final slide here in our personal work email addresses. And yes, Jessica, if you would drop the link to the outcomes data page, that would be fantastic. So Jessica's going to put in the chat a link to the outcomes data page. We're really interested. This doesn't get all the way deep like you were just talking about, but we're asking for CBE programs to submit a pretty basic retention and completion metrics just to start benchmarking and start opening up this conversation. And it includes some questions about their program design, which we hope from that we can start to sort of piece together a much better typology of types of programs out there that would then provide those tools for further research. For anyone interested, not necessarily interested in participating with AIR, but interested in thinking about kind of continuous improvement, we also have a few resources, again, on our website. We have these modularized webinars, so much shorter, more bite-sized webinars about sort of formative ways to think about formative evaluation in your programs. And quite some time ago, Carlos teamed up with us on putting together a student outcomes metrics framework, which you can think about and adapt and refine the definitions and ideas we offer about what to measure and what to look at. Because one of the other things, of course, we didn't get to was, for instance, post-completion outcomes, right? How do people fare in the labor market afterwards? That is super hard to collect and extra hard to compare across different institutions who all might collect something different. But an individual program might have the tools to do that for your own program, at least. Okay, so I think I see the link, but I think it might have just gone to panelists. So if you currently have a program,
sorry about that. I can put it in properly. I didn't notice that.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Yes. So, step one, definitely reach out to us. Please don't hesitate to contact us. As you can tell, we like to talk about this.
One final thought. How can people use this work at their campus?
Great question. So, at your own campus, hopefully, this can be a useful starting point for thinking about questions like models, and even how even if this doesn't answer questions, it might help provide some fodder for thinking about how the model might affect retention or affect completion and time to degree and total net price. The other thing you can do is, if you are just making the case now or trying to think about CBE and whether it would be valuable, hopefully these can be good data points to be able to show internally, right, to folks who are not so sure about CBE or still saying, show me the data, prove that it works. None of this guarantees that any other CBE program will have exactly the same outcomes. Of course, we see that variety already, but hopefully it demonstrates that it's absolutely possible. Carlos, if you had anything else in mind, though, please feel free to add it.
Oh no, that's perfect. That's perfect. So we're right on time. There's Kelly's and Jessica's information. If you guys want to reach out to them, Jessica, Kelly, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your expertise and sharing this with the field. For everyone, for all our attendees, coming up due to the storms, we had to push back our multiple perspectives of a thriving CBE program panel. Is going to be the first panel in the webinar series. So join the University of Mary Hardin Baylor staff as they discuss their CBE program. Hopefully you all can join us. Thank you everyone for being here. Jessica, Kelly, thanks again. This will be recorded, sent out to everyone. And if you all have any follow-up questions, reach out to us or Kelly and Jessica, and we'll be more than glad to answer any questions. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.